Welcome back to lecture 24 now of the history of ancient Rome with the Teaching Company. We are in the midst of the Roman Revolution. We have seen the beginnings of the process with the Gracchi brothers, the escalation toward a politicized military with Marius, the use of that politicized military by Sulla, the continued use of the military and the tribunes by the early careers of Pompey and Crassus. What I want to do in this lecture today is continue the story, basically covering the decade of the 60s BC, not quite the entire decade. We'll stop in the year 63 BC, which is extremely eventful year in Roman history for a variety of reasons. What I wish to do then is outline to you in the course of this lecture the continued rivalry between Pompey and Crassus that was shaping up, threatening to lead to yet another civil war. As we'll see, in fact, Crassus's efforts to block the enormous popularity of Pompey, which in the course of the 60s rose to new heights on the back of various developments in foreign affairs, was to bring into the picture a new and very able, it turns out, player in the political theatre of the Roman Revolution, Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar. So we will introduce Caesar today and look at the early part of his career and maybe capture something of his character from a story or two, and then we will end with a closer look at the year 63 BC, which is an important one in Roman history. Events in the 60s were to catapult Pompey once more into the limelight. He already was something of a darling of the people by virtue of his success in military affairs and because he had helped mop up the Spartan slave revolt. But in the 60s BC, he really became the chief man in the Roman state. There can be no doubt that he was, in the 60s, the most powerful Roman alive. It was events in foreign affairs that were to be the basis for Pompey's continued success. So we must turn our attention once more eastward and once again to Mithridates of Pontus, who had been let off the hook by Sulla, as we saw in the mid-80s, had embarked on a minor round of wars with Rome at the end of the 80s, had then been relatively quiet, it turns out, biding his time until launching another more serious round of campaigns against the Romans in the mid-70s BC. The so-called Third Mithridatic War got underway in earnest in 75 BC, and in the course of this new campaign, Mithridates exploited a new ally. The ally came in the form of pirates who inhabited the area known in ancient times as Rough Cilicia. This is the area along the southern coast of Turkey, and if any of you have ever had the chance to visit there, you'll realize that it lives up well to its ancient name. The mountains of Turkey come right down to the sea at this point. There are plenty of inlets and harbors, lots and lots of caves for the pirates to hide themselves and their loot and their prisoners. And it seems that the pirates of Rough Cilicia formed sort of a brigand kingdom of sorts with forts and fortresses dotted along the coast, and were really largely impregnable and impervious to attack when they were well ensconced in their homeland. But from Cilicia, they would sally out across the Mediterranean, and in fact the whole problem of piracy and brigandage on the land was an endemic one in the ancient world. In the absence of effective police forces and so on, pirates and brigands could always be found in the gaps between the civilized areas. And it seems that in the course of the early part of the 1st century BC, the pirates had grown to new levels of power. In some ways, one can say that the rise of the pirates to such a serious problem is a symptom of the Roman Revolution and the fact that the Senate and government of Rome is not paying attention to its proper duties, as it's so obsessed with the constitutional issues that really lie at the heart of the Roman Revolution. But several stories will illustrate how powerful the pirates had become by the early 60s BC, especially by the year 67 BC, when the war with Mithridates was still ongoing and his alliance with the pirates was proving most effective. The pirates had taken to raiding the coast of Italy itself. They would come right up to the shore and raid coastal towns, and even send in parties inland to attack villas of the rich and affluent that lay some way inland, using the Roman network of roads for their own advantage. They captured, for instance, the daughter of an ex-consul who disappeared and was never seen or heard from again. 2 praetors in their full Roman regalia were seized and captured by the pirates in 68 BC. And they seem to have also launched a raid on the Roman fleet while it was at anchor in the harbour of Ostia, the very harbour of Rome itself. The most important ramification of the activities of the pirates was that the grain supply to Rome was now coming under threat. The Romans themselves imported much of their grain, especially from Sicily and from eastern lands, from Africa as well. And this grain, as we've seen, was one of the many pawns in the Roman Revolution that was often used by tribunes and so forth to promote popular measures, the offer of cheap grain to the people. So the grain supply was something very important to the urban mob of the city of Rome. And the pirates were now threatening that grain supply. And as a result, the power of the pirates had become intolerable to the urban mob, and they wanted something done about this problem. Well, Pompey was on hand. This was his moment. Using a tribune, Aulus Gabinius, he proposed, well, Gabinius proposed, but no doubt with Pompey's full support, undoubtedly at his instigation, proposed a law conferring a vast imperium on Pompey's shoulders to deal with the pirate problem. The law was passed eventually amidst scenes of tremendous disorder. People who in any way tried to question whether or not one Roman should have so much power conferred upon him were shouted down. There's a rather colourful anecdote that on one occasion one of the tribunes attempting to intercede a veto received such a roar of disapproval from the mob that a raven flying overhead was killed by the percussion and dropped onto the ground. But there were scenes of tremendous disorder and violence as Gabinius had his law passed that conferred upon Pompey a new level of imperium, formerly unknown, imperium infinitum, imperium without boundaries. That means that Pompey had power that was not restricted to a specific province. In fact, the power of Pompey, by virtue of this law of the tribune Gabinius in 67 BC, was to stretch over the entire Mediterranean Sea, all the islands in the Mediterranean Sea, and all the coastal regions bordering the sea for 50 miles inland. Pompey would have more power than any one of the governors on the spot throughout this vast area. Furthermore, it was considered that Pompey would need at least 3 years to dispense his duties. So the grant of imperium was for 3 years, or until he'd finished with the pirates, whichever came first. And finally, Pompey was entrusted as the overseer of the Roman grain supply for a period of 5 years. Pompey is now very much a popularis, a man of the people. He's looking after their food interests, and he's been commissioned with the job of ridding them of the problem of the pirates. Despite the fact he'd been given 3 years to complete his commission, so efficient was Pompey's system of dealing with the pirates that he completed the job in 3 months. He divided the Mediterranean Sea into sectors, and with his 24 lieutenants and squadrons of warships supported on the shore with squadrons of infantry, he shepherded the pirates into capture and killing zones and wiped them out. He did capture very many pirates and took many of their strong points in southern Cilicia, in rough Cilicia, And here is one of the signs of Pompey's cleverness. Rather than crucify them all or execute them as brigands, he settled them all as farmers and traders in Cilicia, where they had lived. These men then became clients of Pompey. This actually was also a feature of Pompey's settlement of Spain following his war against Sertorius, which ended at 72 BC. Rather than having executions and proscriptions, he settled the affairs of Spain very, very equitably and reasonably, and was also very popular there. So Pompey's busy building power bases for himself east and west. Well, Pompey is now in the east. His power, his imperium infinitum over the pirates has technically lapsed, but he's no desire to return home. Mithridates is still at large, and he's no particular desire to leave the matter resting there. And so, no doubt, at Pompey's suggestion and instigation, another tribune for the year 66 BC, a man called Caius Manilius, proposes a law transferring Pompey's imperium to the east, to the eastern half of the empire, basically saying he already has this vast power, let's put it to good use and finish this war against Mithridates. This is a successful ploy, and again, amid scenes of considerable disorder, the law of Manilius transferring Pompey's imperium to the eastern half of the empire to deal with the problem of Mithridates is passed in 66 BC. What we see in these 2 years is Pompey making immediate use of the rest of the restored tribunate, which he had helped bring back to its full powers in 70 BC when he was consul with Crassus. So I think that if there's any real doubt about the motives of Pompey and Crassus in restoring the pre-Sullan tribunate, the actions should speak for themselves. The actions of these years speak for themselves. Pompey benefits enormously from the newly restored tribunate. Following this transferal of his imperium to the east, Pompey spent the next 6 years fighting against Mithridates, who finally was murdered and as a result disappeared from the scene. And then he travels around the eastern half of the empire, essentially behaving like a monarch. Pompey, we hear, signs treaties, establishes alliances with foreign powers. He establishes whole provinces. The province of Syria was created at this time. He settles affairs in Judea. He negotiates, although not very successfully, with the king of the Parthians, the neighboring kingdom, who I mentioned earlier had supplanted the Seleucid, the Hellenistic Seleucid kingdom, which disappeared around 100 BC to be replaced by the native kingdom of the Parthians as Rome's eastern neighbor. In fact, Rome's only civilized neighboring state. These people traditionally had their king called the King of Kings, and Pompey pointedly refused to address him as anything other than king. Another story that has come into the general tales about Pompey's behavior in the East and is reflected in biblical literature is his behavior in Jerusalem. When he was in Jerusalem, Pompey had heard about the wonderful antiquity and great power of the Hebrew God. And of course, at this time, Judaism was very much still a temple religion, and he wanted to see the temple of this wondrous God. So he visited the temple, and of course, as you know, Gentiles were not welcome inside. Never mind inside the Sanctum Sanctorum, the inner holy of holies, in which were kept various sacred artifacts. Pompey, being a pagan, fully expected to find in the inner holy of holies a magnificent statue of this wonderfully powerful God, and brushing past the priests, ignoring their protests, he stomped into the holy of holies, came out shaking his head, saying, "What are these people talking about? All there was in there were some scrolls, ancient-looking scrolls of paper. What's the point?" This was, of course, the Torah, the most sacred texts of the Jews, which Pompey couldn't understand. Why would this be what they worship? Where's the golden statue of Yahweh? A good clash of cultures there, but Pompey ever afterwards reviled in Jewish sources for this dreadful act of sacrilege. This is the sort of way he behaved when he was in the East. He behaved basically as a king would. All of this done without reference to the Senate and without any permission beyond his holding of his imperium. By 63 BC then, Pompey had completed his reorganization. He essentially established the Eastern Roman Empire in a form that it would maintain for several centuries. He certainly founded Roman power in the East on a firmer footing than it had been before. And he was finished by 63 BC and ready to return home. People were not looking forward to this. The last time a Roman general had come home from the East, we all know what happened. Crassus, meanwhile, while Pompey was busy in the East, defeating Mithridates and basically behaving like a monarch, Crassus was busy in Rome doing his best to undermine Pompey's position. He backed and proposed through tribunes and other sources several measures that attempted to limit or restrict Pompey's power, or at least establish some kind of a counterbalance that would be in Crassus's hands. I won't go into all the measures because none of them succeeded that he proposed, but I'll mention just one, for example. Internal squabblings within the dynasty of the Ptolemies in Egypt gave Crassus an opportunity to propose that Egypt be annexed as a Roman province, and he proposed, of course, one of his own creatures to be the proconsul of the new province, which would have given him at least a power base, some sort of a territorial footing against which he could maybe set up some stand against Pompey's power, but the proposal was blocked. So this is the sort of thing that Crassus was doing, trying to introduce some level of undermining for Pompey's position. But they all failed. All of his proposals failed, and Pompey's power and popularity seemed to grow greater and greater and greater. As a result, then, Crassus began to back the career of a young nobleman as a foil to Pompey's popularity. The nobleman he chose was the able and ambitious Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in 100 BC of a patrician family with impeccable lineage. He counted among his ancestors the goddess Venus, and through the son of Aeneas, Iulus, the founder of the Roman people himself, Aeneas. However, the family of the Iulii Caesares had not been prominent in politics in the 2nd century or even much before that. For while they had the best and bluest of blood in their veins, they didn't have much cash in their purses. Of course, it was precisely money that Crassus could provide for Caesar's ambitions. A good story surrounds Caesar to indicate something of his character from his youth. The story goes that that around 75 BC, Caesar was visiting with a king in the east when on his returning home, he was captured by pirates. Once more, there are those pirates. The pirates, we are told, said to Caesar that they would ransom him to his family for a fee of 20 talents, at which point Caesar burst out laughing, asked them if they had any idea who they had in their hands, and offered them 50. For the next 38 days, we hear, Caesar stayed with the pirates in their base in southern Cilicia as a prisoner, although he treated them with utter disdain and contempt. He would compose poetry and speeches for their betterment, and if they failed to understand them, he would scold them as illiterate savages. He took part in all their games, usually beating them, of course, and occasionally would joke and laugh that if they gave him any more grief, he would come back one day and hang them all to a man. The pirates thought this was hilarious and put it down to the young blood of a man in his mid-20s. After a certain length of time, it was actually 38 days, the ransom came through and Caesar was released. Immediately upon his release, he gathered up some ships and approached the praetor in charge of the province of Asia, demanding that the pirates be arrested for their crime. When the praetor showed no interest, Caesar acted unilaterally, took his ships, hunted down the pirates, brought them back to the mainland, imprisoned them, and when the praetor refused to act any further, Caesar had them all crucified, just as he had promised in joking with them when he was their captive. The story indicates something of Caesar's temperament, a man, we are told, from very earliest period of his life, rather arrogant, with a great sense of his own importance. This is the man that Crassus backed with his money. Caesar, with Crassus's backing, rose up through the courses in proper order. There is no sign, it must be said right up front, that despite Plutarch's claim that Caesar was a revolutionary from birth, basically, there's no sign of any revolutionary inclinations in Caesar in his early career. He rises up in perfectly good order through the cursus honorum, through the run of offices, and in the year 63 BC wins a great honour, double honour. He is elected to the praetorship for that year, and he also is elected in an unheard of achievement as the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman people. This was a lifetime position and was normally conferred upon a man of much older age and greater experience. So for Caesar, at the tender age of 37, to be given this post was a tremendous boost to his career, because the religious offices of Rome, as we'll see in the later lecture when we look at Roman paganism, were all held by the same people who were the politicians and the generals and so forth. And the various priesthoods added to one's prestige and would help one in one's political career. So being Pontifex Maximus was a great boost to the young Caesar's career, and this he achieved in 63 BC. Still, people waited for the return of Pompey. While they were doing so, a new crisis erupted in the state. A nobleman, Lucius Sergius Catiline in the anglicized version of his name, had 3 times failed to be elected to the consulship, his third and final attempt falling in the year 63 BC. Catiline lost the consular elections in the summer of this year, to another man who we'll be hearing more about, Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Cicero, orator and writer, who's left us such a wonderful legacy of literature. Cicero was a rather mediocre politician, but he was, like most Roman authors, a man of public life. And this achievement of his in being elected as a new man to the consulship of 63 BC was to prove the pinnacle of his political career. But it was to be a difficult consulship and a controversial one. Catiline, having failed in the elections for the consulship of 63, began, it seems, to plot insurrection. In many ways, then, Catiline is very much a product of his age. We hear that he began to raise troops outside of Rome, and within Rome himself, he gathered around him, if we believe our sources, such a band of derelicts and brigands as the world has hardly seen. People completely depraved in character, lacking in funds, ex-slaves, slaves, and so forth. All of these people gathered apparently around Catiline's flag. There is some suspicion in our sources that Crassus had a hand in the conspiracy. There's some suspicion that Crassus was using the Catilinarian effort in yet another attempt to block the power of Pompey, which now was threatening to descend upon everyone from the east when Pompey returned. But the case against Crassus and his involvement in the Catilinarian conspiracy is unproven. Finally, through ways that we will not go into in detail, all of this, by the way, described in considerable detail in Sallust's monograph on the subject, which is part of your required readings. All of this was revealed eventually to Cicero, the consul. Cicero went into the Senate House and in a very dramatic speech denounced Catiline to his face in the Senate House. We actually have that speech. In fact, we have all 4 of Cicero's speeches which he gave on the occasion of denouncing and revealing Catiline's plot to the Senate and then to the people in the tribal assembly of the people. He was denounced, Catiline was denounced to his face and forced to leave Rome. He fled the city to his army outside the city of Rome in Etruria, the area north of Rome. And there, eventually, he was defeated in battle and killed. The conspirators inside the city of Rome were apprehended by Cicero, who stayed in Rome as the consul dealing with the situation there in the heart of the city, and they were imprisoned. They included some rather impressive names from the Roman nobility, men who'd obviously, I suppose in Roman terms, turned to the dark side. And as a result, these men were imprisoned and then summarily executed. This was to be, for Cicero, a source of some later grief. There's, by the way, a good story here in that the men were all, in the Roman fashion, they would have been strangled, garroted in this rather dark and nasty prison on the slopes of the Capitoline Hill, which you can visit today if you're ever in Rome. And the story goes that Cicero announced to the Roman people, awaiting news of the fate of the conspirators, their fate with a single word: vixerunt, they have lived. He announced that that's pretty much the end of their story. The whole episode of Catiline's attempted coup d'etat is very illustrative of the stage that we've reached now, some 70 years into the Roman Revolution. Catiline is a Roman noble who tries, first of all, the constitutional route to get his way. When this fails, he raises an army. He gathers around him a bunch of desperados and people keen for what the Romans call res novae, revolution, new things, and tries to take over the state by force. We don't have to believe all the stories told about Catiline, that he intended to burn the city to the ground and so on and so forth. They're probably accusations level for the sake of rhetorical effect. But what is interesting, and a feature of the Roman Revolution that often goes largely unnoticed, is the readiness with which there seem to be pools of people around who are willing to take up arms against the state as soon as someone raises the banner of insurrection. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus could find such people in 78 BC. Catiline had no trouble raising a significant army in 63 BC. And this reveals again something of another aspect of the revolution, one that's rarely appreciated, but the social and economic side of it. Once again, the Roman government is so absorbed with the constitutional infighting among the ruling oligarchy that they really are not paying attention to the basic running of the state. They're not paying attention to the issues that need to be dealt with. In many ways, they're abusing the very society that they're supposed to be guarding over. And as a result, there are plenty of dispossessed, disillusioned, destitute people wandering Italy, grouped in the countryside. Many of them are also to be reflected in the power of the pirates and the numbers of the pirates and brigands who are to be found in Italy at this time. And so when a desperate man like Catiline hauls up the banner of revolution, there will be takers who will be willing to risk everything for the purposes of taking over the state. So in many ways then the attempted conspiracy or attempted coup d'etat of Catiline is reflective of the stage that we've reached in the Roman Revolution. What we'll see next time in the course of the latter part of the 60s and in the 50s BC is that Pompey's return from the east did indeed spark something of a revolution, but not in the way that many people expected it. There weren't to be proscriptions and mass purges of opponents, but through a series of incidents, a political revolution of sorts was to take place that, for many observers, marks the true end of the Roman Republic.